Boundless Authenticity Podcast.
As far as my research has revealed, there has always been a huge link between the eugenics, mind control agendas, and the psychiatry industry as we know it today. You have heard me talk about the cult of psychotherapy. Well, who heads that cult? Rockefeller is a name that gets thrown around in all things conspiratorial. However, the Rockefellers are not the only contributors. In 1936, the Scottish Rite of Freemasonry sent its representative of research on dementia praecox, Dr. Nolan D.C. Lewis, into the field to contribute to what was known as the field of psychiatric genetics and mind control experimentation. Dr. Lewis was also director of the New York State Psychiatric Institute and was in charge of overseeing 14 projects, which were directly funded by the Scottish Rite. The tough part about tracking information of this nature is that these guys are masters at covering their tracks and in fact have their hands in so many pies that they pretty much control it all. So no one will ever admit to knowing their true involvement, if at all. These cults have historically fought for control and worked together to achieve control, and there is evidence that suggests that during this time of the Freemasonic psychiatric projects, the Nazis also contributed. Franz J. Kallmann, who was a protege of the head of Nazi eugenics program, Ernst Rudin, was discovered to be part Jewish and had to flee from Germany. Kallmann is a quirky character indeed, and is noted for stating to the Congress for Population Science in Berlin in 1935 that all schizophrenics should be sterilized as well as their healthy, not mentally defective relatives. Kallmann later found himself in New York State Psychiatric Institute and was paid by the Scottish Rite to study 1,000 schizophrenics. The goal was to prove that the mental illness is genetic, a myth that is still perpetuated to this day. Kallmann's study was published and publicized in both the US and Germany in 1938. This study later went on to be used as justification for a program launched by the Nazis' T4 unit, where over 200,000 mental patients were brutally murdered. I try my best to avoid using words like Illuminati and New World Order because they have been completely twisted around and tickled like a soggy and saggy pair of balls into submission by the powers that shouldn't be, the media, and the social engineers to have incorrect meaning. Yet another tactic for disabling people's ability to process information and respond accordingly. Essentially, these are the people we are looking to uncover. In other words, the Bavarian Illuminati and the New World Order operatives. Try your best not to get confused or to shut down when hearing this information. This game has been going on from the beginning of time as we know it, and the groups change names and disguise themselves as other groups, seemingly benevolent in order to achieve their goals. I said all that to say this. The role of the Bavarian Illuminati is relevant due to the fact that Wilhelm Wundt, professor of psychology at the University of Heidelberg, was a part of the Rockefeller-funded social control program, and it is noted that Wundt's lineage, specifically his grandfather, was a noted member of the Illuminati and is mentioned in their reports from way back in the year 1782 and onward. Wundt's goal was to change the way people related to the field of psychology. He wanted to make the view that psychology was the study of the soul and mind extinct, and worked to establish the world's first psychological laboratory, which led to the creation of the Psychological Journal of Philosophical Studies around 1875, which went on to change the face and the views of psychology for that century. This was the perfect setup for the mind control and eugenics experiments of the 1930s. Let's go back to Wundt for a moment. Wundt believed that unless the soul or spirit could be scientifically quantified, that it had no place in matters of psychology, and therefore all psychological studies should be based on studying the brain and the nervous system. This redefined man as an animal without a soul. With this definition, they had given themselves rationalization for experimentation, torture and murder without consequence. Wundt's decision to cast to the side the notion of soul, mind, and free will continue to influence psychiatry and psychology to this day. Wundt also agreed with Hegelian ideas that man was just a cog in the machine called the state. This ultimately continued to lead the psychotherapy cult towards being one of the world's greatest mind control organizations. Ivan Pavlov followed after Wundt left his lab at Leipzig in 1884, and by 1906 was beginning his experiments on dogs, where he cut holes in the dog's cheeks and inserted tubes to measure the amount of saliva produced. Just before food was given to the dogs, a bell would be rung, and after some time, it was noted that the ringing of the bell alone would increase the dog's rate of salivation. The idea that responses could be conditioned was quickly transferred over to humans, and those to follow after Pavlov have been controlling our rate of salivation and ringing our bells ever since. And then, of course, there was John B. Watson over at Johns Hopkins University, another Hegelian stronghold. Watson was performing similar conditioning experiments on humans. Watson is noted as saying, "Give me the baby, and I'll make it climb and use its hands in constructing buildings of stone or wood. I'll make it a thief, a gunman, or a dope fiend. The possibilities of shaping in any direction are almost endless. Men are built, not born." This was around the time that he conducted the popular Little Albert experiment. Watson, noted as the founder of the behaviorist school of psychology, believed strongly that humans could be programmed with any kind of behavior. During the Little Albert experiments, the young boy was given a white rat to play with, and after becoming accustomed to the rat, Watson would wail on the floor using a metal bar each time the rat was brought in. The boy eventually became hysterical whenever the rat was given to him, and then, when presented with any small animal, would have the same conditioned response. It is noted that no one has any record of what happened to little Albert, but Watson did go on to become a successful advertising executive. In the latter 1930s, Harvard psychologist B.F. Skinner, who was also a progenitor of Wundt's way of thinking, became the father of operant conditioning, which has shaped modern-day psychological thinking. Skinner's idea was simple, that the reinforcement of negative stimulus or positive stimulus were the root of learned behavior. Using this reward or punishment system, Skinner was able to teach pigeons how to dance and even play table tennis. He did not stop there, however, and his most famous experiment involves something known as the Skinner box. This was to produce a socialized child in a controlled environment, which was the box. It was essentially a crib-sized space which he put children into, even his own. Skinner wanted to control the behavior of isolated people and learn to control society as a whole. Skinner was a big supporter of the New World Order idea and wrote about it openly in his book, Walden 2. Eerily, he describes the education system as we know it to be, where children are turned over to the state by their parents to be subject to what he calls a form of human engineering. Skinner felt the same as Wundt, and felt like humans were soulless machines. Look around you with an honest eye, and you will notice that the whole world is under this type of control, shaped by the most notable psychological minds. Education is the next layer of the cult mind control machine. The education system as we know it today is centuries old, based on the Prussian schooling system from 1819, at which time the first compulsory schooling for children was implemented. The idea was to divide children into groups, those who would become policymakers and those who would help the policymakers, i.e. the doctors, lawyers, engineers, etc., and the children who would make up the masses, to be used. Prussia believed that their defeat by Napoleon's army was because of their people thinking for themselves under stressful battlefield conditions. So Prussia set up a 3-tier education system where half of 1% of the population was taught to think. 5.5% of the rest were taught to partially learn to think. The other 94% were to be taught obedience and order following. This led to the division of ideas into what we call subjects, that is, math, language, art, science, etc. These subjects were then divided into units which were spread out throughout the day to purposely cause disorientation and distraction. Meanwhile, in America, during this period of the late 1800s, saw the takeover of Yale University by the Skull and Bones and the creation of what was originally known as the General Education Board, pioneered by Daniel C. Gilman, a master of Hegelian psychology and a follower of Wilhelm Wundt, as well as Rockefeller cohort Frederick T. Gates. The General Education Board then went on to be renamed the Rockefeller Foundation. Gilman then went on to become the first president of Johns Hopkins University, and he handpicked the best members from the various factions of Hegelian thinkers, including G. Stanley Hall, who went on to take over the psychological laboratory at Johns Hopkins, and then started the American Psychological Association, as well as the American Journal of Psychology. Hall later went on to mentor one of the most influential names in the American education system to date, John Dewey. Dewey was a progenitor of the Prussian philosophy and is noted for saying, "There is no God and there is no soul. There are no needs for the props of traditional religion, with dogma and creed excluded. Then immutable truth is also dead and buried. There is no room for fixed natural law or permanent moral absolutes." Dewey later went on to write books and sculpt the agenda for education even further, stating that the role of the teacher was to be a shrink, socializer, and eugenicist. Dewey believed that it was about how the child related to the state and not how the state related to the child. I could go on more about Dewey and a list of other players in this system, but perhaps the most notable characters here would be James Earl Russell, who became the Dean of the New York College for Training of Teachers, which became the largest institution for the training of teachers in America. Following Russell was Edward Lee Thorndike, who believed teaching was the art of giving and withholding stimuli, with the result of producing or preventing certain responses. In essence, he was talking about brainwashing and behavior modification. Thorndike and his cohort's ideas about the subjugation of the student to the social hierarchy was purposely designed to destroy the literacy rate of the USA while creating the perfect mind control slaves. They believed that humans adapting to their surroundings in this way was for the best interest of all, and that man must be conditioned to accept the circumstances that he finds himself in and not learn to change them. By 1950, the Teachers Training College was the most powerful force in education in America and controlled a third of all school presidents and deans, as well as 1/4 of all teachers. The Wundt psychology had won and established a stronghold, and the Rockefellers now set the standard for what is now to this day considered normal education. I hope that this short episode was informative for you and closes some loops I purposely left open in my earlier episode, Cults, Mind Control, and Brainwashing. If you haven't yet listened to that episode, please go back and give it a listen. Now you can understand how the cult of psychotherapy got started, where its roots come from, and how it outstretches to the most important parts of society. We have all been under the spell of the cult of psychotherapy, and if you are just now waking up, this information is even more pertinent because people around you who are complicit and compliant with their own slavery will likely argue. And yet everything you learned today on this episode can be fact-checked very easily. Please do continue to send me topics you'd like to hear about on the show. And if you're new, subscribe on YouTube, follow on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you are listening on Spreaker, please like this episode and share with your friends. The best way to help this podcast grow is to share the Spreaker link, as all of the episodes will be posted to Spreaker. If you have the Spreaker app on your phone, you will be alerted as soon as new episodes drop. Thanks for listening. I'm Jahan Sator, a CTAA-accredited cognitive behavioral therapist, hypnotherapist, nutrition coach, mindfulness teacher, and specialist in the area of subconscious self-sabotage. You may also know me as the host of Boundless Authenticity. I assist by showing people of all walks of life how to be mindful and allow the negative automatic thoughts about the events of the external and the associated programs to reveal themselves fully so that they can learn to establish deep inner peace and operate from purpose and passion. Much of my work focuses on removing the disempowering thoughts and beliefs from the subconscious mind, which cause us to create less than favorable emotional consequences and circumstances. I teach you various ways to change internal dialogue, clear harsh memories and emotions, and delete useless information from the subconscious. I also teach when to meditate, how to meditate, and why you have certain thoughts and feelings during meditation, and how to handle them effectively. If you or someone you know are struggling with self-sabotaging behaviors and harsh emotional consequences, please do contact me at selfsabotageinfo@proton.me. You're listening to the Boundless Authenticity Podcast, where we discuss everything related to the evolution of human consciousness.
At the very least, people need to understand that the United States builds bunkers, which are basically cities underground, every 3 months.
Basically, when you dream, you tap into your subconscious. It is your nocturnal intuition, your creativity and imagination unchained from conscious reason, ego and logic.
They're biologically alive, but they have no soul. They have AI consciousness. They can alter your conscious of the brain to get the brain.
We live in a multidimensional reality. Whether it comes through esoteric information in the spiritual realms, or the UFO people, experiencers, or mainstream through quantum physics and through mainstream science now realizing that parallel dimensions probably exist.
We're all spiritual beings. We're all having these human experiences. We've heard that phrase over and over and over. But what does that really mean?
You know, all the big questions of life, we have these answers inside of our souls.
We're ultimately studying the nature of what it is to be human, good and evil, our psychology, how we think, and our health. That's why I love Bruce Lee's great quote, all knowledge is ultimately self-knowledge.
The Boundless Authenticity Podcast.